Shabbat Shalom. We are all led by instinctual responses and learned responses. Of course, if something, God forbid, is coming at us at a fast direction, our instinctual response is to duck or get out of the way. That comes from deep within our DNA. But then there are learned responses that come from practice after practice after practice of how we respond in particular situations. For example, let's see what you'll do, how you'll respond after hearing me say these words. Sweet Caroline, good times never seem so good. Learned response. And it almost becomes just like instinct. So that we're not always acting out of fear, without thinking. We have this training built into us to how to respond to certain situations. With that, I want to invite you to turn to Parashat Shemot this week. To the very beginning of the book of Exodus. We know this story. There have been movies made about it. And I want to ask you a particular question as we look at the actions of Pharaoh and of Moses. And the question I want to ask you is, how are their responses different? What do we know about Pharaoh? We know that Pharaoh sees a growing Israelite community. And here we read, of course, the famous line, Vayakom melech chadash asher lo yadat Yosef, that there was a new king who arose over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. This wasn't a king who was friends with Joseph, who understood what Joseph had done for the Egyptian people. And whether you accept the pshat of the text that indeed it was a new person who became Pharaoh, or whether you understand it through the eyes of the rabbis who see this as a person who for one reason or another chose not to acknowledge what Joseph had done for the Egyptians. What we see is a totally new perspective on the Israelites. This new Pharaoh looked upon our ancestors and perceived a threat against the Egyptians. He saw how numerous and how populous we had become. And this Pharaoh said, these foreigners are a threat against the natives. And in his fear, the Pharaoh decided the response was going to be cruelty, oppression, suffering. But his motivation was perhaps well-intended. Maybe he simply sought to protect his population. Pharaoh, acting out of fear, made a choice to protect his people by imposing cruelty on others. What about Moshe Rabbeinu? What about Moses? We know Moses grows up. We know that there comes a time where he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite. And Moses' response, his instinctual response, perhaps his fear for the vulnerable Israelite, is to rise up and to kill the Egyptian. Is that the right response? Is it that different from what Pharaoh did? And we know a little while later that when Moses flees Egypt for his life, and he comes to Midian, he sees some Midianites harassing Zipporah and her sisters. These are not Israelites. But Moses acts out of instinct to protect the vulnerable, chases away the Midianites, and then offers to help Zipporah and her sisters obtain water for their animals. Both Pharaoh and Moses acted out of instinct. Both Moses and Pharaoh sought to protect others. And maybe in some ways we could even justify both men's actions. So how are they different? How are they the same? I invite you to think about that. Because what I see in the rest of the book of Shemot, the rest of this book of Exodus, and then the rest of the Torah is God's response to both Pharaoh and Moses and all of us who typically react out of instinct. And God appears to Moshe Rabbeinu, God appears to Moses at the burning bush and says, I'm with you. You're okay. And then, in a couple parshas from now, God will lay out the entire set of commandments for us so that we don't have to keep reacting out of instinct. We can begin to act out of learned response. And I think if we look at the Torah and then the entire corpus of rabbinic teachings thereafter that comment upon the Torah and help us understand what God wants of us, is that our learned response in every situation should not be to act out of the instinct of fear, but should be to ask two questions. What is just and what is kind? Our prophets will later call it chesed u'mishpat. What is just and what is kind? And we as Jews are taught to study the Torah over and over again, to study the rabbinic teachings over and over again, so that when we are faced with a crisis situation, so that when we are in a difficult moment, so that when we fear for our nation or we see somebody suffering, we know that our response will not be out of the instinct of fear, but will be from learned behavior to ask in this moment what is just and what is kind. And that's true in the case of our own lives being at risk, and it's true when we look at something from afar. We're to ask ourselves the question, what is just? And we're to ask ourselves the question, what is kind? We live in a complex world. We're seeing things that our ancestors could have never dreamed of. And we have access to information and opinion on a level that's never been seen before in history. How do we react to everything we see? What should be our response to the challenges of this world? I might suggest that we ask, what is just and what is kind? And that those two values are the ones that lead us in our response to the complexities of the world. Without study, without a commitment to those values in particular, then we, like far too many else in our world, will respond out of the instinct of fear. And when we respond with fear, we often come to a conclusion that is cruel. Fear leads to cruelty. We all go through different trainings in our life and how we should respond to life-threatening situations. Some of you grew up and learned that the appropriate response to nuclear attack was to hide under very small wooden desks. It at least was a learned response. In our own world, children today are taught how to respond to active shooter situations and to bomb threats, in addition to fire and tornado drills. Because in that moment, when instinct takes over, we want them to choose the response that will be safest for them and for everybody. That's how we train our kids. We know you remember being taught that if you hear the fire alarm go off and you're upstairs, rather than just grab the door and open it up, what do? You check to see how hot it is, because out that door might not be the best response. We have these trainings so that our learned responses overtake our instinct. And I think the Torah is asking the very same things of us. Rather than respond out of the instinct of fear, we should ask two questions, and we should practice over and over again through our study and through our thinking to ask these two questions. What is just? And what is kind? And in that way, our learned response can supersede our instinct of fear. What is just? And what is kind? Learned responses matter. So, for example, if I were to say, hands, touching hands, reaching out, touching me, touching you, sweet Caroline. Good times never seem so good. Shabbat shalom.